She didn't know she was going to die that night. Nobody does. That's how it works. One second you're driving home in the rain, wipers screaming against the glass, radio cutting in and out. And the next second the world disappears beneath you, and all you feel is the cold. So much cold. Water pouring into your lungs like punishment for something you can't even name. But someone was watching from the darkness. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist. And the moment he pulled her out of that river, both their lives changed forever. If this story already has your attention, hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and follow all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that didn't announce itself with thunder or lightning. It just arrived, cold and relentless and indifferent, the way bad things usually did in Oregon. It came down in sheets across Highway 26, washing the painted lines off the asphalt and turning the road into something that looked more like a river than a place meant for driving. Alara Whitmore hadn't slept in 31 hours. She knew that because she'd been counting. It was the kind of thing you did when your brain refused to shut off. You counted hours instead of sleeping through them, cataloged every minute you'd spent staring at the ceiling of your studio apartment in Portland, listening to the radiator knock and hiss while your mind replayed the same footage on an endless loop. The charity gala. The crowd in their tailored clothes, the chandeliers throwing fractured light across 500 faces that all belonged to people with more money than conscience. She'd shot 800 photographs that night. 800. Her camera card was still in her jacket pocket, a small rectangular weight she kept touching with her fingertips the way other people touched rosary beads or lucky coins. Proof that she'd been somewhere. Proof that the work was real. Not that anyone had called her back about it. The assignment editor at Pacific Current had promised a Tuesday turnaround. Tuesday had come and gone. Wednesday, too. Now it was Thursday night, technically Friday morning, 2:17 according to the dashboard clock. And Alara was driving back from Seaside, where she'd spent 3 days shooting a feature on Pacific fishermen that nobody had commissioned and that she wasn't sure she could sell, burning through gas money she didn't have, telling herself this was what it meant to be a freelancer. You stayed hungry. You stayed moving. You didn't think about the rent that was 9 days late, or the camera insurance she'd let lapse, or the fact that her checking account had $43 in it. She reached for the coffee in the cup holder and found it cold. Of course it was cold. The defroster on her 10-year-old Civic had stopped working somewhere around Cannon Beach, and now the windshield kept fogging up in the corners, narrowing her field of vision down to a smeared tunnel of white headlights and dark rain. She wiped the glass with the heel of her hand, leaving a greasy streak, and squinted at the road ahead. The bridge was coming up. She knew this stretch of highway well enough. A narrow 2-lane crossing over the Tillamook River, concrete guardrails on both sides that she'd always privately considered more decorative than protective. The river ran fast under there this time of year, swollen with snowmelt and weeks of accumulated rain. And whenever she crossed it at night, she kept both hands tight on the wheel and her eyes straight ahead. A habit born from the same irrational anxiety that made her check the back seat of her car every time she got in. She pressed the brake. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder, heel of her foot driving the pedal toward the floor, and felt it sink. Not the firm resistance of hydraulics doing their job, but a spongy, collapsing nothingness, like pressing your hand into wet sand. No, she said out loud. Just that one word, flat and strange in the dark car. She pumped the pedal 3 times fast, the way she'd read somewhere you were supposed to, and felt the car actually accelerate slightly on the downgrade toward the bridge, because gravity didn't negotiate. Her hands went white-knuckled on the wheel. She grabbed for the emergency brake with her right hand and yanked it, felt a brief shudder run through the chassis, and then a grinding shriek as the rear wheels locked and the car began to slide sideways on the wet asphalt. The bridge railing filled her entire windshield. She didn't scream. There wasn't time. The Civic hit the concrete barrier at 42 miles an hour. The airbag detonated in her face like a fist, filling her nose and mouth with that chemical burning smell, and then the guardrail gave. It actually gave, old concrete crumbling at the base where rust had been eating through the rebar for years. And the car was airborne for one long, weightless, impossible second before it hit the surface of the Tillamook River. The water came in immediately. Not through the windows, through the floor, through the vents, through every seam and gap in a 10-year-old car that had never been designed to be a submarine. It came in cold and black, and it tasted like iron and mud. And Alara, hanging sideways against her seatbelt, hands still gripping the steering wheel out of pure animal reflex, understood in some deep, wordless part of her brain that she was going to die in this car unless she moved right now. She moved. Seatbelt first. She found the buckle by feel, fingers shaking, pressed the release, and fell against the driver's door. The water was up to her waist already. The car was tilting nose down, pivoting around its own weight, and the windshield had a crack running across it in a jagged diagonal line. She shoved at the door, but the water pressure held it shut, 400 pounds of river leaning against it from the outside. And for 2 seconds she just pushed uselessly, burning through the last of her oxygen reserve before her brain caught up. She needed a window. The driver's side glass was intact. She grabbed the headrest from behind her seat, one-handed, her other hand bracing against the roof as the car continued its slow rotation, and swung it at the window, the metal prongs first, the way she'd watched some survival video explain it 3 years ago while procrastinating on a deadline. The glass spiderwebbed. She hit it again, and it caved inward, and the river came through like something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Cold like nothing she'd felt before. Cold that wasn't a temperature so much as a presence, something with intention, something that wrapped around her chest and squeezed. She went through the window frame, shoulder, hip, the glass catching her jacket and tearing a long strip from the sleeve. And then she was out, tumbling in the black water, completely disoriented, no sense of up or down, her lungs already burning. She kicked. She'd always been a decent swimmer, lap pools in high school, nothing impressive, but her body remembered the mechanics even when her brain couldn't form coherent instructions. She kicked and clawed upward through the dark, and her head broke the surface, and she pulled in one ragged, desperate breath before the current grabbed her and dragged her sideways. The Tillamook River in late November moved fast. It didn't give a damn about her. She went under twice. The second time she wasn't sure she was coming back up. Her legs were already cramping from the cold, her waterlogged jacket and boots pulling her down, and she had that strange lucid thought that drowning people apparently sometimes had, the one where everything gets very quiet and you find yourself thinking about something completely unrelated. She thought about the camera card in her jacket pocket, 800 photographs, $43 in her checking account. Something grabbed her arm. Hard. Fingers like iron closing around her wrist, not gentle at all, the kind of grip that would leave bruises. She was pulled upward with a force that didn't feel entirely human, or at least didn't feel like it was struggling, and then she was coughing river water onto a muddy bank, face down in dead grass and gravel, retching. She rolled over. I was crouching over her, watching her, not with the frantic expression of someone who'd just performed an emergency rescue, with the calm, assessing look of someone taking inventory of a situation, dark clothing, soaked through, water running down his face in rivulets. Big. Not in the exaggerated way of someone who spent their life in a gym, but in the way of someone built for actual use. His jaw was set. His eyes were dark, and in the rain and darkness, she couldn't make out their color. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, checking her pulse with a clinical efficiency that struck her as bizarre given the circumstances. "Can you breathe?" he said. His voice was low, unhurried. She coughed again, a wet, ugly sound. "I'm breathing." "Any pain in your spine? Neck?" "No, I don't. Who are you?" He didn't answer. He was already scanning the riverbank upstream, then downstream, with the systematic attention of someone performing a security sweep rather than standing in the rain next to a car accident. In the distance, she could hear the creak of her car, still audible as it settled somewhere below the surface. "You need to get off this bank," he said. "Can you walk?" "I think so." He stood, and she got her first clear look at him as she struggled to her knees. Dark jacket, collar up. He was already pulling it off. A coat, not a jacket, something heavy and well-made, not the kind of thing you wore if you were worried about getting it wet. He dropped it over her shoulders without asking, without looking at her face when he did it. "There's a rest area 200 meters north," he said. "Emergency phone on the exterior wall. You use that." "Wait." He had already stepped back. Not in a hurry, not running, just removing himself from the equation with the same unhurried efficiency he'd brought to everything else. "Wait," she said louder, pushing to her feet. I need to know," but he was gone. The darkness at the edge of the tree line had simply absorbed him, the way it absorbed everything, and all that remained was the rain and the river sound and the coat around her shoulders, heavy and soaked and smelling faintly of expensive cedar wood, and something she couldn't name. She stood there for 5 seconds. 10. Then she walked north. The ambulance arrived 22 minutes after she found the emergency phone. The paramedics wrapped her in a thermal blanket and took her blood pressure twice because the first reading worried them. A state trooper named Hendricks took her statement in the back of the ambulance while she shook uncontrollably and tried to form coherent sentences, which was harder than it sounded when your body had decided hypothermia was a viable response to recent events. She told him about the brakes, about going through the guardrail, about swimming to the bank. She didn't tell him about the man. She wasn't sure why. Some instinct that she couldn't articulate, some friction between what she wanted to say and what felt right to say, and she just didn't. She said she'd made it to the bank herself. Hendricks made notes. He didn't push her. At the hospital, they kept her overnight for observation. She lay in a bed in the ER bay, separated from the next patient by a thin curtain, staring at the acoustic tile ceiling, cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. And she thought about the brake pedal going soft under her foot, the way it had felt. The complete total absence of resistance. Brakes didn't fail like that. She knew enough about cars to know that brake failure, actual, complete brake failure, didn't just happen. It was caused. It was either catastrophic neglect or it was deliberate, and her car was old, but it wasn't that old, and she'd had the brakes inspected 6 months ago. The receipt was still in her glove compartment somewhere at the bottom of the Tillamook River. Someone had cut her brake lines. The thought arrived with a strange calm, the way true things sometimes did. Not with panic or disbelief, just a flat settling of reality into a new configuration. Someone had wanted her car to go off that bridge. Someone had specifically, deliberately arranged for Alara Whitmore to drive into the Tillamook River on a rainy Thursday night and not come back out. She pressed her fingers against her jacket pocket. The camera card was still there. She got out of the hospital the next morning and went directly to her laptop because her apartment was the only place she had, and a deadbolt between herself and the world felt necessary even if it wasn't sufficient. She made coffee with hands that were steadier than they deserved to be, and she sat at her kitchen table and she pulled up the files from the charity gala, 812 photographs. She went through them methodically, the way she'd been trained to, the way she worked best, not looking for anything specific, just looking, the way you had to if you wanted to find what was actually there rather than what you expected to find. The Harrington Foundation Gala had been a 500-person event at the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall, a fundraiser for Pacific Coastal Conservation, at least on paper, full of Portland money and Seattle money and San Francisco money that had traveled north for the occasion. Alara had been hired by a PR firm to shoot the event, standard corporate event photography, the kind of assignment she took when the editorial work dried up, which was most of the time. $800 flat fee, post-processing included. She'd spent 4 hours circulating through the crowd with a 35mm prime lens, shooting candids and posed groups, and the kind of environmental portraits that PR firms like to use in their quarterly newsletters. She'd been professional about it, thorough. She'd covered every corner of that venue, including, apparently, the wrong corner. She found it on photograph number 437, a wide shot of the cocktail reception room, taken from an elevated position on the mezzanine. She'd climbed up there to get an overview angle, a crowd shot, the kind of image that established scale and atmosphere. In the foreground were the usual faces, polished and social, and performing their charity. In the far background, partially obscured by a support column and the edge of a service entrance door, 2 men were engaged in an exchange that had nothing to do with coastal conservation. One was a heavy-set man in a server's uniform, but his hands were wrong, too steady, too aware, and the way he was standing had a vigilance to it that no caterer ever had. The other was in a dark suit, profile to the camera, face half turned away. Between them, just barely visible in the narrow gap between their bodies, was a case, rectangular, the kind of case that could hold medical equipment, or surveying tools, or weapons, and what appeared to be a thick envelope changing hands. The image was slightly blurred. She'd been shooting at a slower shutter speed for the ambient light, and someone in the crowd below had jostled her arm at the exact wrong moment. But it wasn't so blurred that the forms were unrecognizable. It wasn't so blurred that you couldn't make out, if you knew what you were looking for, and you boosted the exposure and sharpened the edges in post-processing, the face of the man in the dark suit. It took her 40 minutes of editing to make the image legible. It took her another 3 hours on the internet to put a name to the face. Damien Voss. She found him first in a 6-year-old Willamette Week investigative piece that had been quietly taken down from the publication's website but survived in a cached archive. Then in a court document from a federal case that had collapsed on a suppression issue. Then in 3 separate Oregon State Police intelligence bulletins that she accessed through a contact she had in the investigative journalism world. A former federal prosecutor named Gaines, who had a habit of forwarding things he shouldn't. Damian Voss, 38 years old, born in Portland, educated at Reed College for 2 years before dropping out. Alleged head of the Voss organization, a criminal network that had its roots in his grandfather's time and had since expanded from labor racketeering and protection operations into weapons distribution, and, according to the federal intelligence bulletins, a series of import operations along the Oregon and Washington coast that the DEA had been trying to document for 3 years without success. The man who had pulled her from the river, she was certain of it. She compared the gala photograph, post-processed, sharpened, exposure-corrected, to the photographs she found online. There weren't many of him. He seemed to have a preternatural talent for avoiding cameras, which made the image she'd accidentally captured something close to extraordinary. But there was enough. The jaw, the set of the shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that she now recognized, standing on the riverbank in the rain, taking her pulse without hurrying, scanning the tree line. She sat back in her chair and let the full weight of it settle over her. She had a photograph of a known organized crime figure conducting what appeared to be an illegal exchange at a public charity event. That photograph was on a camera card in her jacket pocket, and someone had tried to kill her 2 days after the gala. The connection wasn't subtle. She called Marcus Webb at 9 in the morning. Webb was her oldest contact in Portland journalism, a former Oregonian investigative reporter who now ran a small independent news site and occasionally threw work her way. She trusted him more than she trusted most people, which wasn't saying a great deal but was saying something. "I need to talk to you about something," she said when he picked up. "In person." "What happened to your voice?" Webb said. "You sound like you gargled gravel. River water. I'll explain. Can we meet?" She told him she'd be at his office in an hour. She hung up, pulled the camera card from her pocket, and stared at it for a moment. Then she made 2 copies of the gala photographs, one to an encrypted external hard drive, one uploaded to a private cloud account she'd set up years ago for exactly this kind of situation, the kind of professional paranoia that most freelancers thought was excessive until the moment it wasn't. The originals stayed on the card. She put the card back in her pocket and went to shower and change. Webb's office was on the 3rd floor of a building in the Pearl District that also housed a tax attorney and a Pilates studio, which struck Ilara as a perfectly Portland combination. He buzzed her up without comment, and she found him at his standing desk, reading something on his screen, coffee in hand, silver-bearded and rumpled in the way of a man who had long since stopped caring what he looked like as long as the work was good. She told him everything. The gala, the brake failure, the river, the man who'd pulled her out, the photograph. He listened without interrupting, which was his best quality. When she finished, he was quiet for 10 seconds. "The image is clear enough to be usable," he said. "Clear enough. Not perfect, but clear enough. And you've confirmed the ID." "As much as I can without formal documentation. Everything I've found is consistent. Same physical description, same operational area. The event location fits his profile." Webb set his coffee down. "Ilara, if this is what it looks like, I know. The people who cut your brake lines, I know, Marcus. This isn't a feature story. This isn't even an investigative piece. This is the kind of thing that gets—" "I know," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. "I know what it is. I'm sitting here telling you because I don't know what to do with it, and I trust you, and I need a second opinion on whether I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing." Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he came around the desk and held out his hand, and she gave him the camera card, and he spent 15 minutes at his monitor going through the images while she drank his coffee and stared out the window at the gray Pearl District street below. "You're seeing what you think you're seeing," he said finally. She nodded. "I need to make some calls," he said. "I have a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I want to feel out whether there's a federal angle here before we decide anything." "Okay. Don't go home tonight." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "Don't sleep at your apartment. Go stay with someone. Don't use your regular phone for anything you don't want someone to potentially listen to. And Ilara," he paused, "don't talk to anyone else about this. Not yet." She took the camera card back and stood. How long before you hear from your contact? 24 hours, maybe. I'll call you. She went back down to the street. Portland moved around her in its usual Thursday morning rhythm. Coffee shops and dog walkers, and the light rail running its route 2 blocks east. And she stood on the sidewalk outside Webb's building and thought about brake lines and river water and a man who had looked at her in the darkness with those calm, assessing eyes, and then walked away like he'd simply finished one item on a list. She pulled up her phone and searched the name again, Damien Voss. The search results were thin. The Willamette Wheat cached piece. A brief mention in a society column from 8 years ago. An event, black tie, his name listed among attendees without any context. One photograph, blurry and taken from a distance, that showed a man she was now certain was him getting into a black SUV outside a restaurant in northwest Portland. She screenshotted everything. She walked 2 blocks north away from her usual route home and flagged a rideshare rather than walking to the bus stop. She gave an address 2 streets away from her actual destination, the habit of someone who'd spent enough time around people with things to hide that some of their caution had transferred to her by proximity. She was staying with her friend Cam, a nurse who worked nights and wouldn't be home until morning, who'd given her a spare key years ago and never asked for it back. The apartment was quiet and clean and not connected to a Laura Whitmore in any database she was aware of. She sat in Cam's living room with the camera card in her hand and tried to eat half a granola bar and thought about a man pressing 2 fingers to her neck to check whether she was alive. The call came at 11:15 the following morning. It wasn't Webb. She didn't recognize the number, which was a 503 area code but not one she had in her contacts. She almost didn't answer it. Some instinct made her pick up. Ms. Whitmore. A voice she recognized immediately, in the way you recognize something that had been printed into you under extreme circumstances. Low. Unhurried. The same voice that had asked her if she could breathe. She didn't say anything for 3 full seconds. I know you remember, he said. Don't pretend otherwise. It's a waste of both our time. How did you get this number? That's not the question you should be asking. She stood up from Cam's couch, moved to the window, looked down at the quiet residential street below with the reflexive vigilance of someone who'd been operating on threat awareness for 36 hours straight. Nothing unusual. A dog walker. A FedEx truck pulling away from a house 2 doors down. What question should I be asking? She said. The men who cut your brake lines have a name for what you have, Damien Voss said. They call it a loose thread. And they are, at this moment, trying to determine exactly how loose. Her hand tightened on the phone. What do you want? I want the photograph. That's not... I know you've made copies, he said, without inflection, without accusation. I know you have the original. I know you've duplicated it, and I know you showed it to a journalist named Webb yesterday morning. I'm not asking you to give me something you haven't already distributed. I'm asking you to have a conversation. The FedEx truck had stopped at the end of the block. She watched it. A conversation about what? She said carefully. About the fact that what you photographed is a great deal more complicated than you understand, he said. And about the fact that the people who want that image destroyed are not people I have any interest in protecting. She processed that. You're saying you'll help me, she said. I'm saying we may have interests that align. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. The FedEx truck pulled away. Just a truck. She made herself breathe steadily, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd trained herself when she was in difficult field situations. The kind of breathing that kept your hands steady for a shot. Where? She said. I'll send you an address, he said. Come alone. Tell no one, including Webb. A pause. And Ms. Whitmore, bring the coat. The line went dead. She stood at the window for a long moment, camera card in one hand, phone in the other, the gray Portland morning pressing against the glass. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a cold, clear voice was telling her that she was already past the point where careful choices were available to her, that those choices had been taken away on a bridge over the Tillamook River by whoever had decided she needed to die. And what was left now was just the question of who she trusted with the wreckage. She looked at the address that arrived 40 seconds later. An hour north of Portland, up into the hills east of Highway 30, past the logging country into the kind of territory where the tree cover was thick enough and the roads unmarked enough that you could put a structure there and be very confident that the only people who knew about it were the people who were supposed to. She picked up the coat from Cam's hall closet where she'd hung it to dry. Cedar and something she still couldn't name. She went to her rideshare app and requested a car to an address 3 miles from the one he'd sent her, because old habits didn't die just because the situation had gone fully sideways. And then she stood at the door with her camera bag over her shoulder and the coat folded over her arm. She thought about what Webb had said. Don't talk to anyone else about this. She thought about brake lines and cold river water and 200 pounds of current dragging her sideways in the dark. She opened the door and the car dropped her at a trailhead parking lot off a gravel access road that didn't appear on her Maps app's standard view. She'd had to switch to satellite to even find it. The lot was empty except for a black Range Rover with Oregon plates parked at the far end, engine running, exhaust rising slowly in the cold air. She walked toward it. The passenger window lowered as she approached. The driver was a compact, dark-haired man she didn't recognize, late 40s, with the kind of face that had been arranged into a permanent neutral by long practice. He looked at her once, then straight ahead. "Get in," he said. "I'd like to know where we're going first." "That's not available information," he said, still looking straight ahead. "Get in." She thought about it for 4 seconds. Then she got in. They drove for 22 minutes up roads that got progressively smaller and less maintained, the Range Rover taking the switchbacks with the practiced ease of a vehicle that knew this territory well. The tree cover closed overhead, Douglas fir and hemlock pressing close on both sides, and the gray sky above narrowed to a strip and then disappeared entirely. She kept her phone in her hand out of habit and watched the signal bars drop from 3 to 1 to nothing. The estate appeared at the end of a private drive behind a gate that opened before the car reached it, someone watching from somewhere, or sensors she hadn't seen. Past the gate. A compound. That was the only word that fit. Not a house, but a collection of structures arranged with purpose. A main building, 2 or 3 outbuildings, what looked like a garage complex, all of it set against a hillside and screened from above by the tree canopy. Lights on in the main building despite the gray morning. 2 men visible near the entrance, their bearing and their positioning making their function obvious. She noted all of it, old reflex. The driver stopped in front of the main entrance and got out without speaking and walked inside. She sat for a moment, then followed. The interior was not what she expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Some cinematic version of criminal excess, maybe. Black leather and weapons on the wall, and the particular atmosphere of threat that crime dramas always attributed to these kinds of spaces. What she found instead was a place that looked, more than anything else, lived in. High ceilings and dark timber and a fire going in a stone fireplace at the far end of a long main room. Books on shelves that didn't look decorative. A large table scattered with maps and laptops, and the debris of people who actually worked, at it. Damien Voss was standing at the far end of the room with his back to the fire. In daylight, or what passed for it through the tall windows, she could see him clearly for the first time, taller than she'd registered in the dark. Dark-suited, no tie, the collar open. Expensive clothes worn without ceremony, in the manner of someone for whom expense had long since stopped being notable. Dark hair, not quite black, worn short. The eyes she'd registered on the riverbank were darker than she'd thought, the color of old wood, and they were watching her with the same quality of attention that had unnerved her before. Not hostile, not warm, simply present. Completely present. The kind of attention that felt like being measured. He said nothing for a moment. Let her take him in the way she'd taken the room. Then, "You came alone." "I came alone," she said. "You didn't tell Webb." "I didn't tell anyone." She held up the coat. "You asked for this back." He made no move to take it. "Keep it." It was an excuse to call. She set it over the back of a chair. "You know my name. You know who I met with yesterday. You got a phone number I've used for less than a week. I'd like to know how." "Resources," he said simply. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that's available right now." He moved away from the fireplace toward the table and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Ms. Whitmore." "I'd rather stand." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. An acknowledgement of something. "Fine," he said, and sat himself, which she hadn't expected. Men who operated from positions of power in rooms they controlled rarely sat first. The gesture disoriented her slightly, which she suspected was its purpose. "The men in your photograph," he said. "The individual in the server's uniform is a logistics coordinator for an organization called the Salcedo Group. They operate primarily out of Mexico, but they've been building infrastructure on the Pacific coast for the past 4 years. What you photographed was the early stage of a weapons shipment arrangement, prepayment confirmation, manifests, logistics documents in the envelope. She watched his face. And you, and me, he acknowledged, without flinching. I was present at that meeting, not as a participant. That's a convenient distinction. It's an accurate one, he said. I've been building a dossier on the Salcedo Group's Pacific operations for 18 months. What you photographed was intelligence gathering. My presence at that meeting was not what it appeared to be. You're telling me you're not the criminal, she said flatly. You were there to watch the criminals. I'm telling you that my interests and the Salcedo Group's interests are directly opposed, he said. And I'm telling you that whoever you expected me to be, the reality is more complicated. She studied him. Why would I believe that? He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small drive, which he set on the table between them. Because on that drive is 18 months of documentation that you can verify independently. Financial flows, shipment records, personnel files. Things that a man protecting the Salcedo Group would not hand to a photojournalist. She looked at the drive but didn't reach for it. They've identified you, he said. The Salcedo Group. They know your name, your address, your professional contacts. They believe you have evidence that can be traced back to that exchange. They've been debating since Wednesday whether to send another team. The word another settled in her chest like weight. The brake lines, she said. A subcontractor. Someone they use for this kind of preliminary work. His voice was neutral, almost clinical. They didn't anticipate a surviving witness. They didn't anticipate you. No, he said. They didn't. She let the silence sit for a moment. Outside the tall windows, the trees moved in a wind she couldn't hear through the glass, and the gray light had shifted slightly toward the flat white of approaching weather. What do you want from me? She said again. The same thing I said on the phone. Your photograph and mine, together, they tell a complete story. What I have documents the Salcedo Group's infrastructure. What you have documents the moment of transaction. Combined, they constitute something close to irrefutable. Irrefutable to who? The right people. That's another non-answer. He looked at her steadily. The people who can dismantle this operation without my name appearing in a federal filing, he said. I'm not in a position to explain further than that right now. She absorbed this. Thought about Webb, who she'd been told not to call. Thought about the U.S. attorney contact that Webb was supposedly reaching out to, and wondered, with a new chill, whether that was a line that had already been tapped or compromised. You pulled me out of that river, she said. Why? Something passed across his face very briefly and was gone. You were drowning. You didn't have to be there. I was there, he said. You were drowning. She held his eyes for a moment. Whatever was behind them, and she'd spent 10 years photographing people, learning to read faces the way musicians read scores. It wasn't simple. I'm going to need 24 hours, she said finally, before I agree to anything. He nodded. No argument, no pressure. You'll stay here in the meantime, he said. Her jaw tightened. That wasn't part of... The Salcedo Group has a standing team in Portland, he said. They know your movements. The friend whose apartment you were using, the nurse Cam, her address is in their file. If you leave this compound in the next 24 hours, I cannot guarantee your safety. She stared at him. I'm not making you a prisoner, he said. I'm telling you what the situation is. She looked around the room, the books on the shelves, the fire, the maps on the table. 24 hours, she said. He stood. I'll have someone show you to a room. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. Voss? He stopped. The person who arranged to have my brakes cut, she said. Are they still alive? He turned and looked at her over his shoulder. Those dark eyes, unhurried as always. What do you want the answer to be? She didn't say anything. He walked out of the room. She stood in the warmth of the fire in a fortified compound in the Oregon hills, surrounded by men with weapons and a man she didn't understand, with a story building in her camera card that was bigger than anything she'd ever shot, and she thought about the feel of the current dragging her under in the dark, and the hand that had closed around her wrist. And she thought, everything is already different. She just didn't know yet exactly how different it was going to get. The room they gave her was on the second floor, east-facing, with a window that looked out over the tree line and a lock on the inside that she tested twice before she was willing to sit down on the edge of the bed. The furniture was plain and solid. A bed frame of dark timber, a dresser, a writing desk, a lamp that threw warm light against the wood-paneled walls. Someone had left a stack of folded clothes on the dresser, women's clothes in roughly her size, which told her either that Damien Voss kept a supply of such things on hand for reasons she didn't want to think about too carefully, or that someone had moved very quickly after she'd agreed to stay. She didn't change. She sat on the edge of the bed in her own clothes, which were still slightly stiff from the river, and she listened to the compound. It had a sound, this place. Not the sound she would have expected. No raised voices, no sense of menace in the walls. What she heard was the low register of a working building. Footsteps in corridors. A door closing somewhere below. The distant sound of what might have been a generator, steady and mechanical. Once, voices. Two men speaking in a shorthand she couldn't parse from this distance, clipped and functional. She picked up her phone out of habit and stared at the blank signal indicator. No bars. She was completely dark. She set the phone face down on the writing desk and put the camera card beside it and the external hard drive she'd brought in her bag beside that. And she sat in the lamp-lit room and tried to think clearly, which was harder than usual because her body still hadn't fully forgiven her for Wednesday night. There was a low, persistent ache in her left shoulder from hitting the car door. Her hands had a slight tremor that came and went. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the current pulling at her legs. She opened them again. Think. What she had. Images. Documentation. A story that was real and verifiable and big enough to matter. What she didn't have. Any way to verify a single thing Damien Voss had told her. His version of the gala, intelligence gathering, opposed interests, 18 months of dossier work, was internally coherent, which meant nothing. Internally coherent was the baseline requirement for a good lie, what she couldn't explain away. The drive he'd put on the table. The fact that he hadn't taken the camera card when he'd had the opportunity, in the ambulance aftermath, when she'd been hypothermic and barely functional. The fact that she was in a room with a lock on the inside rather than the outside. None of that proved anything. She was still running it in circles when the knock came at her door, around 7 in the evening, and she opened it to find a woman standing in the corridor. Late 50s, silver hair pulled back severe, a face that had been handsome once, and was now something better than handsome, authoritative in the way of a person who had earned it through a long series of difficult decisions. "Dinner," the woman said, not an invitation. "I'm not hungry." "That's irrelevant," the woman said. "You haven't eaten since this morning. Come down." Alara looked at her for a moment. "Who are you?" "Marta," the woman said, as if that answered the question completely. The kitchen was at the back of the main building, separated from the formal spaces by a corridor, and it was large and functional and smelled like garlic and something slow-cooked and good. 3 men she hadn't seen before were eating at one end of a long table. They looked up when she entered and then looked away, a deliberate courtesy that she recognized as something that had been practiced. Marta set a plate in front of her at the other end of the table and poured coffee without asking. The food was simple: rice, braised meat, vegetables, and Alara ate it because Marta was right about the eating, and because the smell had unlocked something in her stomach that she hadn't been aware of until the food was in front of her. Damien came in while she was on her second cup of coffee. He stopped when he saw her, registered her presence with a brief look, then poured his own coffee and sat down 2 seats away from her with a laptop and a stack of papers and went to work as if she weren't there, which was, she suspected, deliberate. She watched him work for 30 seconds. He had the focused economy of movement of someone who didn't waste anything. No shifting in the seat, no checking the phone, just the work and the coffee and the occasional turn of a page. "The man in the server's uniform," she said. "In my photograph. Do you have his name?" He didn't look up. "Rogelio Mendez, 41, originally from Sinaloa. The Salcido Group uses him for preliminary transaction meetings because he has no criminal record in the United States. Does he know who I am?" "He knows a photographer took a misdirected shot. He doesn't know how much is visible in the image." He turned a page. "That assessment may have changed in the past 48 hours. Based on what?" Now he looked up. "Based on the fact that they tried to kill you and failed. That changes their calculus." "How?" "Because now they have to assume you know why." She processed that. "They'll escalate." "Yes." "And Webb?" His expression shifted, the faintest tightening around the eyes. "Webb made contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office yesterday afternoon, specifically with an AUSA named Carver who handles organized crime cases." She set her coffee down. "How do you know that?" Because Carver has been on the Salcedo Group's payroll for 14 months, he said. Within 2 hours of Webb's call, Mendez's handler was briefed that a Portland journalist named Marcus Webb had brought forward photographic evidence from the Harrington Gala. The kitchen was very quiet. The three men at the far end had finished eating and left without her noticing. Webb is in danger, she said. Webb is already being watched, Damien said. I have someone on him. He's currently at his home. He's safe for now. She stared at him. The flatness in his voice, not cold exactly, but deeply, professionally controlled, was the most unsettling thing about him. She was beginning to understand. Not cruelty. The absence of any performance at all. You have someone watching my contact, she said carefully, without my knowledge. Yes, that's not... I made a decision with available information, he said. Webb made a call I anticipated. Carver is a compromised official. The sequence was predictable. It's not your call to make. Someone needs to make it, he said simply. He closed the laptop. You can be angry about that. It won't change what's useful to be angry about and what isn't. She held his gaze and felt a complicated heat moving through her chest that had several components she didn't fully want to examine. You anticipated Webb's call, she said. How? You couldn't have known which contact he'd use. I knew he had two routes, Damien said. Federal or independent. Carver is the federal contact every independent Oregon journalist uses for organized crime tips. It's a known channel. Known to you. Known to people who pay attention. She pushed back from the table. I need to warn Webb. You have no signal. Then give me a phone that, if you contact Webb right now, from this compound or any number connected to me, you tell the Salcedo Group's monitoring network exactly where you are. He said it without inflection, without frustration. You wait until morning. I'll have a clean line available. She stood at the edge of the kitchen, jaw tight, the anger moving through her looking for somewhere to go. She didn't argue because she couldn't find the flaw in his logic, which was its own kind of infuriating. Good night, Ms. Whitmore, he said, and opened the laptop again. Possum. She didn't sleep well. This was not surprising. At 3 a.m, she gave up on the pretense of it and sat at the writing desk with the lamp on low and went through the drive he'd given her on her laptop. The files were extensive. Spreadsheets, scanned documents, photographs, audio transcriptions. She spent 2 hours cross-referencing what she could against things she could verify from memory or from files she had locally stored, and by 5 a.m, she had confirmed enough to accept that the documentation was real, not fabricated. The financial records had internal consistency across too many variables to be constructed. The personnel files included identifiers that matched public records she could verify. The shipment documentation had routing codes that correlated with actual Pacific port manifests, which she knew because she'd done a story on port security 2 years ago and still had reference material from it. Damien Voss had been building a case against the Salcedo Group, which still didn't tell her who he was building it for, or what he intended to do with it, or what role he'd had in the operation before deciding to document it. It didn't clear him of anything. It just complicated the picture considerably. She closed the laptop as the gray light started coming through the window, and she could hear the compound beginning to move below her. He found her in the main room just after 7, standing at the tall windows with a coffee she'd made herself in the kitchen after Marta had appeared, silently deposited supplies, and disappeared again without offering conversation. He was carrying a phone. Burner, he said, clean number. Webb won't recognize it, but tell him the exchange rate on the Tillamook. He'll understand it's you. She took it. The phrase was something she and Webb had established years ago, a verification code from a story they'd worked on together that involved sources who needed confirmation of identity. The fact that Damien Voss knew it meant his intelligence on her was deeper than she'd assessed. She filed that away and stepped out onto the covered exterior walkway to make the call. Webb picked up on the second ring. It's me, she said. The exchange rate on the Tillamook is 37. A pause. Where the hell have you been? Somewhere safe. Listen to me carefully. Carver is compromised. Do not... Marcus, listen. Do not send anything to Carver. Do not contact him again. Treat everything you told him as burned. Another pause, longer. She could hear him breathing, processing. How do you know that? I'll explain when I can. Are you at home? Office. Leave. Go somewhere they don't know. Don't use your regular route. Ilara, what is going on? Where are you? I can't tell you right now. I'll be in contact in 24 hours. Please, Marcus, move. She hung up before he could ask more questions she couldn't answer, and stood on the walkway with the cold Oregon morning against her face and the smell of fir trees and wood smoke, and the particular texture of a situation that had already escalated beyond any parameters she'd originally set for it. She went back inside. Damien was at the table with two other men she hadn't seen before, one young, sharp-faced, with the particular restless alertness of someone who operated on not enough sleep as a lifestyle choice, and one older, heavy-set, with careful eyes. They stopped talking when she came in. "I need to be part of whatever conversation is happening," she said. The young one, sharp-faced, watchful, looked at Damien. Damien looked at her. "Sit down." She sat. The young one was introduced as Reyes. No first name offered, none given. The older one was Callum, which she suspected was also not his full name. Both were introduced without title or explanation, in the manner of people whose function was self-evident to everyone in the room who mattered. "The Salcedo Group moved an asset into Portland last night," Reyes said. He had a slight Pacific Northwest flatness to his consonants and the rapid-fire delivery of someone who organized information by urgency. "Rios. He runs their domestic enforcement. He doesn't get activated for peripheral problems." "What's a peripheral problem?" Alara said. "One loose photographer," Reyes said, without particular unkindness. "Rios coming in means this got elevated. Someone above Mendez made a decision." "Why would they elevate it?" she said. "If all they know is that a photographer has a blurry image, they don't think that's all you have anymore," Callum said. His voice was quiet and measured, the voice of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where the wrong word had real consequences. Carver briefed them on Webb's contact. Webb told Carver you had significant photographic evidence. That's the language he used. She absorbed that. Webb overstated it. "Webb is a journalist," Callum said, without judgment. "He led with the most compelling version." "And now Rios is in Portland," she said. "As of 4:30 this morning, yes." She looked at Damien. He was watching her with that complete unnerving attention. "And Webb?" "We're watching Webb," Damien said. That's not enough." "I know." He looked at Reyes. "Move him." Reyes nodded once and stepped out of the room with a phone already in his hand. She watched this happen, a decision made, implemented, in the time it took to nod, and felt something she didn't entirely like feeling, which was the recognition that this operational efficiency was genuinely useful. That in the specific context of what was happening to her, the particular skill set assembled in this room was exactly what the situation required. She didn't like feeling that because it made the calculation complicated in ways she didn't have bandwidth for. "What does Rios do?" she said. "Specifically." Callum and Damien exchanged a look so brief it was almost imperceptible. "He makes problems disappear," Callum said. She held that for a moment, looked at the table, looked at Damien. "All right," she said, "then we need to move faster than they do. What does combining your documentation with my images actually give us? Who can we take it to that isn't compromised?" Damien leaned forward slightly. For the first time, she had the sense of something shifting beneath the controlled surface, something like focus sharpening. "That's the right question," he said. "I'm a journalist," she said. "It's what I do." Something moved at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "There are two federal prosecutors I believe are clean. One in Seattle, one in San Francisco. Neither has organizational crime jurisdiction over Oregon, but both have the standing to escalate to someone who does. The problem is documentation delivery, getting what we have to them in a form that creates an obligation to act rather than an opportunity to bury. Publication," she said immediately. "You publish it simultaneously. You take it to a federal prosecutor and you publish it. The moment it's in print, you can't bury it." "Publishing it means your name is on it," he said. "It confirms to the Salcedo Group that you have what they think you have." "My name is already on it," she said. "The moment Carver told them about Webb's call, my name was on it." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "It is." She felt the weight of that confirmation land somewhere in her chest and stay there. She'd known it since the kitchen last night, since the moment he'd said Carver is compromised. She'd known it and been not thinking it, in the way you not thought things that were too large to process while you were still in the middle of them. "Then protecting my name isn't the priority anymore," she said. "Building something they can't stop is." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. She and Damien at the main table, documents spread between them, laptops open, the drive's contents mapped against her gala images in a cross-reference matrix that was her idea, and that he executed with a systematic efficiency she found, against her judgment, genuinely impressive. Callum moved in and out. Reyes reported back. Webb had been moved to a clean location, a contact of Reyes in southeast Portland, a woman named Park, who ran a small translation business and had been doing operational favors for Damien's network for 3 years without incident. The first time their hands nearly touched, reaching for the same document at the same time, both pulling back at the last second. She registered it and cataloged it and set it aside, because there was no version of that calculation that was useful to her right now. She noticed that he did the same. By 2 in the afternoon, they had the outline of something real. A joint package, her photographic documentation, his financial and logistical records, that told the story of the Salcedo Group's Pacific Coast operation from inception to present day. A story that named names and cited figures and identified the moment of transaction that her camera had accidentally captured. They had the outline. What they didn't have was a delivery mechanism. The Seattle prosecutor is a woman named Adler, Damien said. I have a contact who can get the package to her desk within 6 hours of dispatch, but I need 48 hours to prepare the documentation in a format that she can act on without being blocked by jurisdictional questions. 48 hours, Ilara said. Minimum. She looked at the window. Gray afternoon light, the trees moving steadily now in a building wind. And in 48 hours, Rios operates on authorization. He won't move without clearance from above. Damien paused. I believe we have a window. You believe? He met her eyes. I don't deal in certain ties. No, she said. I imagine you don't. She stood and stretched, her shoulder giving a familiar protest, and walked to the window and stood with her coffee cooling in her hands and looked at the hillside where the trees moved in the wind and thought about what 48 hours meant, in a compound in the Oregon Hills with a man who unsettled her in ways she hadn't fully mapped yet. Voss. Yes. She didn't turn around. The people in your organization, they know who I am. They know why I'm here. Yes. How much of what I've told you about the images, about Webb, about my methods, how much of that stays in this room? A pause, longer than his usual ones. All of it, he said. You have my word. She turned. He was still at the table, watching her, and for once the controlled surface was slightly less controlled than usual, something underneath it that she couldn't name but that registered as real. Your word, she said. It's not nothing, he said quietly. Not in this organization. She held his gaze. Somewhere below them a door opened and closed, and someone's boots crossed a hard floor, and outside the wind pushed through the hemlocks with a sound like breathing. 48 hours, she said. He nodded. It was on the second night that Reyes came back from Portland, and his face told her everything before he said a word. He appeared in the doorway of the main room where she and Damien had been working in the particular silence of people who had run out of words for the immediate problem and were working through it differently. She with her laptop, cataloging images, he with his papers, doing something financial and methodical that he hadn't explained and she hadn't asked about. Reyes's jaw was set wrong. That was what she saw first. A man with a habitually precise face suddenly not quite holding its arrangement. Webb's location, he said to Damien. What happened? Not a question. Damien had already put the papers down. Someone gave it up, Reyes said. Park's contact list was compromised. We don't know when. Could have been a week ago. Could have been older than that. Rios had a team on the address within an hour of Webb arriving. Ilara was already standing. Is he? She started. He got out, Reyes said. He's alive. He left the building 20 minutes before the team arrived because he's been doing this long enough to know when something feels wrong. He called the number I gave him and we pulled him to a third location. He paused. But they hit the building anyway. She felt something go cold and very still in her chest. Park, she said. Reyes looked at the floor, just for a second. She was there, he said. She didn't get out. The room held that for a moment that felt longer than it was. Ilara didn't say anything. She stood very still, and she felt the grief and the horror and the fury moving through her in a wave that started cold and turned hot, and she made herself hold it because she couldn't use it yet, which was the worst thing about this kind of moment, that you had to hold it and keep functioning because falling apart was a luxury that the situation didn't offer. An innocent woman in a building because of a photograph that Alara Whitmore had accidentally taken at a charity gala while shooting a corporate PR assignment for $800. Rios escalated without authorization, Damien said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Reyes with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not rage exactly, but the specific, contained, terrible quality of a man whose calculation of acceptable cost has just been permanently revised. Either that or authorization moved faster than we estimated, Reyes said. Where is Webb now? Clean house on Sauvie Island. My contact personally. No digital trail. Damien nodded once. Looked at the table. Said nothing for 5 seconds. Then he looked at Alara. She met his eyes. Her jaw ached from holding it tight. This changes the timeline, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, and she was distantly grateful for that. Yes, he said. We can't wait 48 hours. No. Then what do we have, she said. Right now. What can we move right now? He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw it. The moment he made a decision, visible in the slight shift of his jaw, the breath he drew. Not performance. Commitment. More than I've given you access to, he said. She stared at him. There are things I held back, he said. Insurance. Things I kept compartmentalized because I didn't know how far I could trust. He stopped. Started again. There is a second layer to what I've built. It names people higher than Mendez and higher than Rios. It goes up. How high? She said. And before he could answer, the first explosion tore through the night, close enough to rattle the windows and throw light across the tree line, and every alarm in the compound went live at once. The explosion came from the east perimeter. Alara knew it was east because the windows on that side of the main room blew inward first, not shattering, just flexing violently in their frames. A pressure wave that hit her chest like a fist and made the lamp on the table swing on its cord. The alarm sound wasn't a conventional alarm. It was 3 short tones repeated, a code, and every person in the compound responded to it the way musicians responded to a downbeat, immediately, without confusion, each moving to a predetermined position. Damien was already at the door. Stay here, he said. It's not a request. He looked at her with a directness that left no space for argument. Reyes materialized at his shoulder. On her. Then Damien was gone into the corridor and she could hear him outside, his voice low and clipped, coordinating something she couldn't see, and Reyes was positioning himself between her and the east-facing windows, with his hand inside his jacket and his eyes moving in a systematic pattern across every entry point in the room. She stood in the middle of the floor and made herself breathe. Think. What do you know? One thing at a time. The explosion had been perimeter, not interior. That meant breach attempt, not successful breach. The alarms were coded, which meant the response was organized. She was in a room with a trained operative, and a man she was increasingly certain had run scenarios exactly like this one in his head many times before. She was not, at this precise moment, dead. That was the baseline. Build from there. How many ways out of this building? She said to Reyes. He glanced at her. 4 ground level, 2 elevated. And the vehicles? Garage on the north side. Is it on the same perimeter as the explosion? He looked at her differently now. No, opposite side. Then that's where we go, she said, if this room becomes untenable. He didn't argue with her. That told her something about his training. He was evaluating the logic, not the source, which meant he was good at his job. A second concussion, further away, southeast. The lamp swung again. Her heartbeat was fast but not uncontrolled, and she noticed that with a detached clinical interest, the way she'd noticed things under pressure in the field before, in Juarez, in the aftermath of the port fire in Astoria, the 3 times she'd been in situations where something had gone wrong and her body had elected to stay functional rather than panic. She'd never fully understood it. She was grateful for it. Reyes had his phone out, listening to something through an earpiece she hadn't noticed before. East fence is down, he said, but they haven't pushed through. Why not? Testing response. He was moving toward the corridor door as he said it. Standard probe. They want to know what they're walking into before they commit. Then we have a window. Maybe 5 minutes. Where's Damien? Command position, north building. He held the door. You were right about the garage. They moved through the compound in the dark and the cold, Reyes ahead and slightly left, his hand out of his jacket now invisible, and Alara 2 steps behind with her camera bag on her shoulder because she'd grabbed it without deciding to, pure reflex. The way a photographer's body made certain choices independent of the rest of them. The compound was a different place at night under threat. What had seemed almost calm in the daytime, functional, inhabited, the particular texture of a place where work got done, had stripped down to its actual nature. She could see it now. The positioning of every structure, every light, every entry point had been determined by the logic of defense. This place had been built by someone who expected exactly this. She filed that away. The north building was a lower structure attached to the main building by a covered walkway, and she heard Damien before she saw him. His voice, still controlled but operating at a different register now, something harder underneath it, speaking to 2 men she recognized from the perimeter crew. He saw her and Reyes enter, and his expression did something quick and complicated that resolved back into control so fast she almost missed it. Almost. "Garage," he said to Reyes. "Take her to the second vehicle. Keys are in it." "I'm not leaving," Alara said. "There are 8 armed men on my east perimeter. I know, I heard the second explosion. They're probing, not pushing, which means they don't know your layout, and they're waiting for information." She held his gaze. "Which means someone told them where this compound was and told them to wait for further instruction. This isn't a full assault, it's a message." I was looking at her with that measuring expression she was starting to recognize as his version of surprise. "She's not wrong," Callum said from somewhere behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. Damien looked at Callum. Something passed between them. "Rios doesn't probe," Callum said quietly. "He hits. This isn't Rios's operation." The room held that for a moment. "Then whose?" Reyes said. Nobody answered. And the silence had a quality to it, a texture of something known but not yet said, that made the back of Alara's neck go cold. She looked at Damien. His jaw was set. His eyes had moved to the window, the dark tree line, and whatever he was seeing or not seeing out there, he had gone somewhere internal, some rapid assessment that she wasn't party to, and she recognized with certainty that he already knew the answer to Reyes's question. "Voss?" she said. He came back. Looked at her. "Whose operation is this?" A long beat. The alarms had gone to a single sustained tone, lower, and somewhere outside she could hear vehicle engines. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Both of you." He looked at Callum. "The room." The room was a space she hadn't seen yet, behind the command area. Small, windowless, a server rack along one wall, and a table with 2 monitors. Damien unlocked it with a key code and a secondary physical key, the kind of redundancy that spoke to the value of what was inside. He pulled up a file on the left monitor. She stood beside him and read. It took her 90 seconds to understand what she was looking at, and another 30 to understand what it meant. And in those 30 seconds, something happened in her chest that was specific and identifiable and terrible. The particular sensation of a structure you'd been relying on giving way. The file was a financial record. A payment record, to be specific. Transfers, carefully layered, running through 4 shell entities before arriving at a final destination. She followed the chain with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent enough time looking at financial documents to read them the way other people read text. The final destination was a corporate entity registered in Delaware. The corporate entity's beneficial owner, listed in the registration documents in the 4th attached file, was a name she recognized. Marcus Webb. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes went back to the top of the document and read it again, because the first reading could always be wrong. The first reading was always conditioned by expectation, and a good photographer and a good journalist both knew that you never trusted the first reading of anything. The second reading said the same thing. Marcus Webb had been receiving payments from a Salcedo Group shell entity for 11 months. "How long have you had this?" she said. Her voice was absolutely level. 6 weeks, Damien said. She turned and looked at him. Something in her face made Reyes take a half step back. 6 weeks, she said. "I couldn't verify it completely until 6 weeks. Her voice had changed now, the levelness cracking along a specific line. "While I was trusting him, while I was going to him with information about, with everything, with the photograph, with Carver, with my location. Alara, don't." She stepped back from the monitor. Her hands were doing something she couldn't entirely control, a fine, rapid tremor that had nothing to do with cold. "He told me not to go home." He told me not to contact anyone. He was the one who suggested Carver. She was talking to herself now as much as to anyone. The one who suggested Carver was the one being paid by the people who cut my brake lines. She stopped, breathed. Park, she said. The woman who died. Rios hit that location within an hour of Webb arriving. 1 hour. That's not a compromised contact list. She looked at Damien. Webb told them. His expression confirmed it without words. He told them where he was going, she said. Which means he knew Reyes was connected to you, which means he was feeding information this entire time. She felt something harden in her chest, a rapid crystallization of grief into something less manageable and more useful. From the beginning. When I came to him with the gala photographs, he wasn't calling the U.S. attorney to help me. He was calling to report what I had. The brake lines were already in motion before your meeting with Webb, Damien said carefully. He didn't initiate the threat against you, but he amplified it. He confirmed what you had. He confirmed it to Carver, who confirmed it to the Salcedo group. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, a physical gesture against something that felt physical. I gave him everything. I told him about you. I told him about the compound. She looked up sharply. This attack. He gave them a location window, Callum said from the doorway. He'd followed them in, and she'd forgotten he was there. Not precise coordinates. Webb didn't have precise coordinates, but enough to narrow the search. Enough for an 8-man probe team to find your east perimeter, she said. Yes, Damien said. She stood in the small, windowless room with the server rack humming and the monitor throwing blue light across Damien's face, and she held the entirety of it in her mind. 11 months of payments, Park's name, the explosion outside, Marcus Webb's voice on the phone telling her to move, go somewhere safe, don't use your regular number. All of it reorganized now around a different center of gravity, all of it meaning something different than it had 48 hours ago. How was my most trusted contact, she said. Flat. Not asking for sympathy, just stating the fact of it the way you'd state a measurement or a distance. 12 years. Nobody said anything. There was nothing useful to say. She looked at Damien. Where is he right now? Sovi Island, Reyes said. The clean house. He's still there? As of 40 minutes ago. She looked at Damien. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Not pity, not calculation, something in between that had a quality of genuine attention to it. I want to talk to him, she said. That's not, I want to talk to him, she said again. In person. Elora, if Webb knows you're alive and has a working line to the Salcedo group, he doesn't know I'm here. He thinks I'm in the wind. She held Damien's gaze and felt the new hardness in her chest and recognized it for what it was. The specific resolve of someone who has had something taken from them and decided not to absorb it quietly. I'm not asking you to send a team to extract him. I'm asking you to take me there. The two of us. Clean, no flag. I sit across from him and I find out exactly what he gave them and exactly what they know. You're a photographer, Reyes said, not unkindly, not an interrogator. I've been sitting across from people who didn't want to tell me things for 10 years, she said without looking at him. I'm very good at it. Damien held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, we deal with the perimeter first. It took 40 minutes. The probe team on the east perimeter had withdrawn, testing and then pulling back, confirming what Callum had said about the operation's intent. A message, not an assault. We know where you are. We can reach you. She stood at a window and watched the perimeter crew work in the dark, systematic and quiet, and she thought about 12 years of phone calls and lunches at a counter place in the Pearl District that Webb liked because the coffee was good, and the story they'd worked together in 2019 about undocumented port workers that had been the best thing either of them had produced, and the way he'd looked at her across the table when she'd played him the gala images, leaning forward, intent, and she hadn't had any reason to know, that what she was reading as journalistic excitement was something else entirely. She'd read him wrong, completely wrong, and she was someone who read people for a living. That was what sat heaviest. Not the betrayal itself, but the failure of her own perception. They reached Sovi Island just after 2 a.m, Damien driving, one of Callum's men in the vehicle behind them, the roads empty and black and slick from earlier rain. The clean house was a single-story structure set back from the road behind a screen of alder trees, the kind of place that looked like a fishing cabin and had been used as one, once, before Reyes's network had acquired it for operational purposes. A light was on inside. Damien cut the engine 100 meters from the driveway. He can't know I'm coming, she said. He won't. You go in first. Tell him you have a new development. You need his assessment. Something that requires his expertise. He'll want to seem useful. Damien looked at her in the dark of the car. And then? Then I come in, she said, and we see what his face does. The thing about a trained photographer was that you developed a very specific relationship with the human face. You learned to see it faster than it could manage itself, faster than the conscious mind could instruct it to perform. A face could lie. A face could not lie fast enough. Damien went in alone. She waited 4 minutes by the clock on the dashboard, which was 4 minutes of sitting in a dark car on a dark road, while her blood moved fast and everything in her was very awake, very present, the way it had been in the river, the way it had been on the riverbank. She got out and walked to the house and opened the door. Webb was sitting at a small table with a coffee mug, and Damien was standing near the window. And when she came through the door, Marcus Webb's face did 3 things in less than 1 second. First, recognition. Second, relief. Genuine, unmistakable. And then, just behind it, almost simultaneous, something else. A recalibration. The eyes going fractionally flatter, the shoulders settling differently, the smile that came up half a beat too late. Third, the managed version. The friend. The worried contact. Elara, thank God. Where have you been? I've been... Stop, she said. He stopped. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and put both hands flat on the table between them and looked at him. The Delaware entity, she said. MTW Pacific Holdings, 11 months. Do you want to tell me the number, or should I tell you? The managed version held for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them, watching his face do the math. What she knew, how she knew it, whether there was a play available. There wasn't. She could see the moment he understood that. What was left when this managed version finally let go was something she hadn't expected, which was that he looked tired. Not frightened, tired. The bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he can put it down, even if putting it down means everything else is also over. How long have you known? He said. Since tonight. He nodded slowly. His hands were around the coffee mug. The compound. They found it. You gave them enough. I gave them a radius, he said. Elara, I didn't know they were going to send a team. I didn't know about the woman. He looked at the table. I didn't know about Park. Did you know about my brake lines? A long pause. I knew they were planning something, he said. I didn't know what. I told myself it was just surveillance, that they just wanted the card. He exhaled. I told myself a lot of things. She looked at him. Why? It was the only question that mattered. Everything else, the mechanics, the timeline, the specific transactions, she could reconstruct. The why was the thing she needed to hear him say. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. 3 years ago, I was inside a story about Salcedo's port operations. I had a source. They found my source. And they came to me and they said, they were very clear about what would happen if I published. He looked up. I have a daughter. She's 11. The room was very quiet. So you buried it, she said. I buried it. And then they wanted more than silence. They wanted a set of eyes in the journalism community. Someone who could tell them when things got close. He put the mug down. I told myself I'd never let anyone get hurt. Park is dead, Marcus. His jaw worked. He didn't say anything. She sat with him in that silence for a moment, and she felt the grief and the fury, and underneath both of them, something colder and more complicated, because she understood the mechanism of it, understood how a person got from there to here through a series of individually survivable compromises, and understanding it didn't forgive it, but it made it real in a way that pure rage couldn't accommodate. What did you tell them about me? She said. Everything. From the beginning, he told her. It took 20 minutes. She listened without interrupting, cataloging, organizing, identifying every piece of intelligence that had moved from her through Webb to the Salcedo network over the past 5 days. The photograph, her copies, the compound's approximate location, Reyes's connection to Damien's network, the plan to reach a prosecutor. When he finished, she looked at Damien, who had been standing at the window the entire time, still as something load-bearing. They know about Adler in Seattle, she said. They'll move to block the approach before we can make contact. Damien nodded once. And they know about the second layer of your documentation, she said. or they know it exists. Yes, he said. She looked back at Webb. He was watching her with the expression of a man waiting for a sentence to be read. She didn't feel the satisfaction she'd expected to feel. She didn't feel much of anything that was simple. You're going to help us fix this, she said. He blinked. Not because I forgive you. Because a woman is dead. And because the people who paid you for 11 months also put me in a river and you are going to carry that. She leaned forward slightly. And because you have a daughter, Marcus. And the only version of the next year where she still has a father is the one where you help us finish this. Webb looked at the table. His throat moved. What do you need? He said. She sat back. Her shoulder ached. The tremor in her hands had been gone for the last 40 minutes, and she noticed that too, the way her body had made another of its quiet decisions about what the moment required. Everything they think they know about our plan, she said. Every piece of information you gave them, we're going to use against them. Every assumption they've built on your intelligence, we're going to let them keep until we're ready to move, and then we're going to move in exactly the opposite direction than they're expecting. She could feel Damien looking at her from across the room. There's one more thing, she said to Webb. The second layer of Damien's documentation, the names above Mendez and Rios. What did you tell them about it? I told them you had access to a source with significant organizational intelligence, Webb said. I didn't know specifics, but they know it exists. Yes. She looked at Damien. How high does it go? He held her gaze, and in the low light of the Savi Island cabin, with the rain starting again outside and Webb's coffee going cold between them, he finally said the name he'd been holding back. She heard it, and understood immediately why the Salcedo group wasn't just sending Rios. They were sending everything. The name Damien said in that cabin on Savi Island was Senator Raymond Holt. Elara knew the name. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest knew the name. 3 terms in the Senate, infrastructure champion, the man whose face appeared on the cover of Oregon Monthly twice in the last decade with headlines about coastal economic renewal and maritime development funding. A man so thoroughly embedded in the architecture of Pacific Northwest public life that removing him would require something close to demolition. She stood in the low light of the cabin and let the full weight of it reconfigure everything. Holt has been providing federal cover for the Salcedo Group's port operations for 6 years, Damien said. His voice was level but had that different register underneath it, the one she'd heard during the attack. Import clearances, customs flagging suppression, strategic reassignment of federal inspection personnel. In exchange, the Salcedo Group has been funding his campaign infrastructure through a network of PACs that traces back to the same Delaware shell chain that paid Webb. Webb, still at the table, didn't look up. If Holt goes down, the entire federal protection apparatus for their Pacific operation collapses, Damien continued. Without that cover, every shipment they have in transit is exposed. Every port arrangement falls apart. That's why they're not just sending Rios. They're sending everything, because this is existential for them. And for Holt, she said, Holt has more to lose than the Salcedo Group. They can rebuild. He can't. She looked at Webb. Does Holt know about me? Webb's jaw tightened. I mentioned the photographer. I didn't use your name with Holt directly. That went through Carver. But Carver briefed Holt. Carver briefs Holt on everything. She pressed 2 fingers against her temple, organizing. So Holt knows about the second documentation layer. He knows about your dossier. She looked at Damien. That's why the probe last night wasn't Rios. Holt has his own security apparatus. He wanted to assess what he was dealing with before the Salcedo Group went kinetic. Yes, Damien said. Which means we have a window, she said. Right now, between Holt's assessment team reporting back and the Salcedo Group receiving authorization to escalate, there is a gap. How long? Damien looked at Callum, who'd been standing in the doorway throughout. Callum made a sound that wasn't quite words. 12 hours, Damien said. Maybe less. She was already moving toward the door. They were back at the compound by 4 in the morning, and the next 6 hours were the most compressed of her professional life, which was saying something because she had a memory of 6 hours in Juarez once that she still occasionally dreamed about. The plan she laid out was simple in architecture and brutal in execution. Webb, operating under controlled conditions at the compound, would make contact with Carver and deliver a specific piece of disinformation, that Damien's documentation was being moved to a legal team in Portland for independent verification, that the package would be in transit by noon. This would pull the Salcedo Group's interdiction focus toward Portland, toward road and transit monitoring, away from the actual delivery mechanism. The actual delivery mechanism was Alara, not to Adler in Seattle. Adler was burned. The Salcedo group knew about Adler. Instead, she'd spent 40 minutes on a clean line in the early morning hours, reaching a contact she hadn't used in 3 years, a woman named Teroko Sato, who ran the investigative desk at a national outlet with Washington Bureau access and the specific professional credibility to put a package in front of a federal official in a way that created an immediate obligation to act rather than an opportunity to suppress. Terko had asked 3 questions, listened to the answers, and said, "Get me the package by 2 p.m. and I'll have it in front of the right people by 4. That was the mechanism. The problem was the distance between 4 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, across territory that the Salcedo group was actively monitoring, with a senator's private security operation also now in play. Damien sat across from her at the main table as she laid it out, and he listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting. And when she finished, he said, "Webb making that call is the weakest point. I know. If Carver doesn't believe him, Carver will believe him because Carver has been believing him for 11 months, and people believe what their history tells them to believe." She held Damien's gaze. "Webb is very good at this. That's the thing I've had to accept. He's been very good at this for a long time." Something moved in Damien's expression. Not pity, acknowledgement. "You're certain about Sato," he said. "As certain as I am about anything right now, which isn't much, but she's the best I have." "All right." He stood. "Then we move at 9. Botam." Webb made the call at 8:47. She stood in the doorway of the communications room and watched him do it, his voice completely steady, completely natural. The voice of a man who'd been performing a version of himself for 11 months and knew every note of it. Carver believed him. She could hear it in the quality of the call's end. Carver asking 2 clarifying questions, Webb answering them with precisely calibrated detail, and then a silence that meant Carver was already composing the message he'd send to the Salcedo group's handler. Portland. Noon. Documentation in transit. Webb hung up. He sat looking at the phone on the table. "That's the last thing I do for them," he said. Not to her. Not to anyone in particular. She didn't respond. He went to find Damien. They left the compound at 9 in a vehicle she hadn't seen before. A gray panel van, unremarkable, Oregon commercial plates. The kind of vehicle that was invisible on the I-5 corridor because there were thousands of them. Damien drove. Reyes was in the back. She was in the passenger seat with the package. A waterproof case containing the complete combined documentation, her gala images, and Damien's 18 months of intelligence, cross-referenced and formatted by the 2 of them through the night. On her lap, her hands resting on it, her eyes on the highway. The morning was gray and cold and very ordinary. Traffic moved around them at normal speed. The world didn't know. It never did. That was the thing about these moments. The world outside went about its Thursday business, coffee, and commutes and unremarkable days. While inside a gray van on a Pacific Northwest highway, 3 people carried something that could dismantle a senator's career and a cartel's infrastructure, and it looked like nothing at all from the outside. "Reyes," Damien said quietly. "Got one," Reyes said from the back. "Black Tahoe, 4 vehicles back, been with us since the junction." Her stomach tightened. "Salcedo?" "Plates are clean, private registration." A pause. "Holt's people." So Carver had briefed faster than they'd expected, or Holt had his own monitoring that didn't depend on Carver's timeline. She turned this over quickly. Holt's security team on them didn't necessarily mean interception. It might mean surveillance, documentation of the package's destination, building a legal suppression case. Or it might mean something simpler and less procedural. "They're not moving up," Reyes said, "maintaining distance." "They want to see where we go," she said. "Yes," Damien said. "Then we don't go where they expect." She looked at the highway. "Where can we make the exchange with Sato that isn't our original location?" Damien thought for 3 seconds. "There's a transit hub in Tualatin. Busy enough, public enough, cameras everywhere, which cuts both ways." "Cameras cut in our favor if something happens," she said. "They don't want a public incident." "Probably." "Probably is what we have," she said. He glanced at her sideways, and she caught the edge of something on his face. Not quite a smile, not quite not a smile. And then his eyes went back to the road. She called Sato on the clean line and changed the location. Sato, who had clearly done this kind of thing before, said, "Understood," and hung up. The Tualatin Transit Hub was a regional bus and light rail interchange, glass and concrete, perpetually mid-morning busy with commuters and students, and the general cross-section of people who used public transit in the greater Portland area. She walked in from the south entrance with the case under her arm and found Sato exactly where she'd described, near the East Concourse coffee kiosk, short, 50-something, gray-streaked hair, wearing a green jacket she'd mentioned specifically, so there was no ambiguity. They had done this before, in a different city, years ago. Sato took the case and handed her a receipt, an actual printed receipt, Sato's way of documenting chain of custody, and said, 2 p.m. latest. 2 p.m., Alara confirmed. Who do I credit? Not me, not yet. Sato looked at her. You look terrible. Thank you. Be careful, Sato said. She walked toward the north entrance, the case tucked under her own arm now, unhurried, a journalist with a story. Alara stood at the coffee kiosk and bought a coffee she didn't need, and watched Sato's green jacket move through the crowd until it was gone, and she felt something release slightly in her chest, not relief exactly. Too early for relief, but the specific sensation of one irreversible step being completed. She turned to go back to the van. The man was standing between her and the south entrance. She didn't know his face, but she knew the type, and the type was unmistakable. Mid-40s, the particular physical economy of someone trained in the suppression of obvious tells, wearing the kind of clothes that were chosen specifically to be unmemorable. He was looking at her with a directness that had nothing social about it. He said, Miss Whitmore, we'd like to speak with you. She looked at his hands. Empty. She looked past him at the south entrance. Two more, positioned outside the glass, visible from this angle. She looked at him again. Senator Holt sends his regards, she said. Something in his face confirmed it without moving. She calculated the case was gone. Sato was gone. The documentation was in transit, and there was nothing these three men could do to stop what was already in motion, unless they took her and used her as leverage to reach Sato before 2 p.m. That was the play. She understood it now. They hadn't been following the documentation. They'd been following her because she was the connective tissue, the person who could identify the source, the person who could make calls and stop deliveries and create enough legal complexity to delay publication past the point of operational usefulness. I'm not going anywhere with you, she said. That's not really... She turned and walked north through the concourse, fast but not running, because running in a transit hub drew attention, and attention was either her best protection or her worst complication depending on the next 30 seconds. She had her phone out and hit Reyes's number as she walked. It rang twice. South entrance, she said. 3 of Holt's. I'm going north. She heard Reyes say something clipped to Damien and then movement sounds. She went through the north entrance into the gray morning and turned east along the concourse exterior and felt the footsteps behind her before she heard them, that specific pressure of pursuit that she'd felt once before, in Juarez, and that her body apparently stored in a memory separate from her conscious mind because her legs were already moving differently, already adjusting. Stop. His voice from behind her, louder now, the professional neutrality giving way to operational urgency. She didn't stop. She went around the corner of the building and almost walked directly into Damien, who took her arm, not rough, precise, and redirected her toward the van, which was idling 15 feet away with Reyes behind the wheel. They were in and moving before the man in the unmemorable clothes cleared the corner. She looked back through the rear window. He'd stopped. He was on a phone, his face doing something she recognized as the controlled expression of a man reporting an outcome that was not what his employer expected. She turned forward. Her coffee was still in her hand. She'd somehow kept it through all of that. Holt, Damien said. 3 of his. They wanted me to call Sato. Use me to stop the delivery. She took a breath. They'll try to reach Sato directly now. She needs to know. Damien handed her the clean phone. Sato picked up on the first ring. I know, she said before Alara spoke. I've got 2 on me as of 5 minutes ago. I made them in the parking structure. Her voice was professionally calm. The package is not with me. Alara closed her eyes for 1 second. Where is it? With my courier, already en route. These gentlemen are welcome to follow me wherever I go. A pause. I've been doing this for 23 years. Tell your source I've navigated worse. She hung up. Alara set the phone down and looked out the window at the gray highway and felt the enormous, peculiar tension of a situation that was both completely out of her hands and completely dependent on what she'd done with her hands in the past 6 hours. Reyes was driving. Damien was in the passenger seat. The van moved north and east, back toward the compound, and no one spoke for several miles. Then Damien said quietly, without looking at her, "You did well." She didn't say anything. The coffee was cold in her hand. "I mean that," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's not the part I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the highway, at the gray sky, at the Douglas firs going past in their dark green rows. "Park," she said. "I'm thinking about Park." He didn't try to answer that. She was grateful. They were 40 minutes from the compound when Reyes said, "Vehicle behind us." Not Holt's people. The Tahoe was gone. Either they'd given up or redirected. This was something else. Something faster, closing the gap at a rate that wasn't consistent with highway traffic. "How many?" Damien said. "One visible. Could be coordinated." She turned in her seat and looked. A black sedan, 4 back, moving in the practiced way of a vehicle driven by someone with specific training. Not aggressive. Not yet. Just closing. Patient. "Rios," Damien said. It wasn't a question. Reyes checked the mirror. "Matches the description." Her heart rate did something specific, and she noted it and set it aside. He wasn't supposed to be activated, not until the Salcedo group got Holt's assessment back. "Holt's people reported 40 minutes ago," Damien said. "That was enough." She looked at him. His jaw was set, his hands on the dashboard, not the wheel. He wasn't driving, Reyes was, and she could see him calculating, running the roads forward in his mind. "The compound is exposed," she said. "Yes." "Callum, Webb." "I know." He had his phone out. The sedan was 3 vehicles back now. She watched it, and she thought about the 12 hours she'd estimated for the Salcedo group's response window. And she thought about how 12 hours was an estimate built on incomplete information. And incomplete information was the baseline condition of every situation she'd ever been in. And she thought about Park, who had been in her kitchen in southeast Portland when Rios's team had arrived. She thought about what she'd said to Webb in the cabin on Sauvie Island. The only version of the next year where she still has a father. The sedan moved up 1 more position. "Voss," she said. "Yes." "Whatever documentation you have at the compound, Callum needs to move it. Right now. Not to another room. Out." He was already speaking into the phone. She looked at the sedan and thought about the warehouse on the drive's documents, a location that appeared in 3 separate Salcedo Group logistical records as a coordination point for Pacific Coast operations, an abandoned industrial facility on the Willamette south of Portland that she'd flagged during the night's work, and that Damien had confirmed was the group's primary operational hub in the region. If Rios was behind them, the hub was the center of gravity. Everything led there. She'd understood that since 2 in the morning, working through the documents while the compound slept around her, following the logistical threads to their convergence. She hadn't said it out loud yet because saying it out loud meant committing to what it implied. And what it implied was something she was still working up to. The sedan closed another gap. "Damien," she said. His first name. She'd used his last name for 3 days. He looked at her. "The warehouse on the Willamette," she said. "That's where this ends. You know that." His eyes held hers for a moment. In the gray highway light, with the van moving and Rios behind them and Callum on the phone ahead of them, she could see the thing beneath the controlled surface with more clarity than she'd seen it before. Not just the calculation, but what the calculation was protecting. "Yes," he said. "Then we need to stop driving away from it," she said, "and start driving toward it." Reyes glanced in the rearview mirror at Damien. Damien looked at the road ahead for a long moment. Then he said, "Take the 43 south." The van changed lanes. The sedan followed. And somewhere south of them, on the Willamette waterfront, in a building that appeared on no public registry and had been a coordination point for the systematic movement of weapons and money along the Pacific coast for 4 years, the last confrontation of this particular war was... The warehouse had been a paper mill once, 3 decades ago, before the economics of Pacific Northwest timber changed, and the building became a shell that the Willamette waterfront slowly absorbed into its general landscape of industrial forgetting. 4 stories of concrete and corrugated steel, loading docks facing the river, a rail spur that hadn't seen traffic in 15 years running along the south wall. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it appeared to be. A dead building in a row of dead buildings, the kind of structure that cities kept meaning to redevelop and never quite got around to. Inside, according to Damien's documentation, it was the operational heart of the Salcedo Group's entire Pacific Coast network. Reyes took the 43 south and the sedan followed, maintaining distance, and Damien made 4 calls in 12 minutes, his voice low and specific, the shorthand of a man coordinating people who didn't need things explained twice. She listened and mapped what she could. Callum was moving the compound's remaining documentation. 3 of Damien's people were already south of them. 2 more were coming from the east side of the river. How many do they have inside? She said during a gap between calls. Variable. Logistics days, 8 to 12. If Rios called ahead, he called ahead, she said. Then more. She nodded, looked at her hands. Steady. She was past the point where her body was going to give her useful information about the wisdom of what they were doing. The body had accepted the situation. It was just moving forward now, one breath at a time, the way bodies did when the options had narrowed to a single corridor. There's something I need to say to you, Damien said. She looked at him. Before we get there. He was looking at the road, his profile in the gray light, jaw set in that familiar way. What happens inside that building? I can't control all of it. I want you to understand that. I know. I don't mean tactically. I mean... He stopped, started again, and she could hear the cost of it, the particular friction of a man who'd spent years making his words economical, suddenly requiring more of them. If something goes wrong in there, if I can't... He stopped again. Damien, she said. He looked at her. I know, she said again, and meant it differently this time. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, then looked back at the road. Reyes, in the front seat, said nothing. He had the quality of a man who knew when to be furniture. They left the van 4 blocks north of the warehouse in a lot behind a closed marine supply company, and the sedan that had been following them overshot their position by half a block before whoever was driving understood what had happened, and by that point Reyes was already moving and the sedan's ability to reposition was complicated by Damien's 3 people who had materialized from the east side of the street with a coordination she could see had been rehearsed, not improvised. She didn't watch how that resolved. She was moving south with Damien through the cold morning river smell and the specific Portland waterfront quiet of an industrial block before business hours, the camera bag still on her shoulder because she had not once put it down and didn't intend to. You brought your camera, he said, not quite a question. I always bring my camera, she said. He didn't tell her to leave it. She was grateful. The warehouse's south entrance was a personnel door set into the loading dock wall, steel-framed, coated lock that Damien bypassed in 40 seconds with a device Reyes had handed him in the van. The particular competence of a man who had planned this approach before tonight, even if tonight was when it became necessary. The door opened onto a stairwell that smelled of river damp and machine oil and something chemical she couldn't identify. She followed him up. Second floor was storage, crates, unmarked, in configurations that told her things she didn't need specific knowledge to understand. She photographed 2 of them from the stairwell door without stopping, pure reflex, the shutter sound swallowed by the ambient noise of the building's ventilation. Damien glanced back at the camera, and his expression was unreadable, but he didn't stop her. 3rd floor was where the voices were. She heard them before the stairwell door, a low register of Spanish and English moving back and forth, the sound of a working room rather than a tense one. People who didn't yet know that the morning had gone sideways. Damien stopped on the landing and held up one hand, and she stopped, and they stood in the stairwell breathing quietly while he listened. He held up 3 fingers. She understood. 3 voices, meaning at minimum 3 people, probably more. He looked at her, held her gaze, then pointed at her, then at the wall beside the stairwell door, and made a staying motion. She shook her head. His jaw tightened. She shook her head again and held up the camera, and he read what she was saying. I'm documentation. I'm the reason we're here. I'm not waiting in a stairwell. And she could see him calculating the argument and the counter-argument and the time it would take to win it versus the time they had. He moved to the door. She followed. What happened in the next 4 minutes she would remember afterward, in the specific fragmented way of extreme experience. Not as a continuous sequence, but as a series of high-resolution images, which was perhaps appropriate. The room was large and lit by work lights strung from the ceiling beams, 4 men visible initially. the nearest one turning toward the door with an expression of pure operational surprise that lasted less than a second before training took over. Damien moved into the room with a directness that was nothing like violence in the movies, none of that choreography, just a controlled and systematic efficiency that was harder to watch than choreography because it was real. Reyes had come through a secondary entrance she hadn't known about, north end of the floor, and the coordination between them had the quality of something deeply practiced. She was against the east wall, camera up, shooting. The muscle memory was absolute, her body holding the professional position while her mind did something else entirely, some split state she'd experienced before in difficult field situations, where the photographer and the person inhabited the same physical space without fully overlapping. The fifth man she didn't see until he was between her and the wall. It was large and he moved fast and he had her arm before she could fully process that he was there, a grip that was nothing like Damien's grip in the river. That had been precise, purposeful. This was pure containment, and for a moment that lasted too long. He had her pinned against the east wall with her camera crushed between them and her right arm at an angle that was generating a very specific and clarifying pain. She drove her heel onto his instep and her elbow back into his ribs simultaneously, the way she'd been taught in a self-defense course 8 years ago that she'd thought at the time was excessive professional caution. He didn't release her arm, but he moved, slightly, enough, and she torqued sideways and got her back to the wall and got a half-second of space. Damien crossed the room in 3 steps, and she didn't see exactly what happened next because she was looking at the floor, catching her breath, holding her right arm against her chest, where something in her shoulder was singing a very high note. When she looked up, the man was on the floor and Damien was standing over him and breathing, actually breathing. For once the controlled surface not entirely in place, his eyes finding her across the room. "Elara, I'm fine," she said. Her shoulder wasn't fine, but that was a later problem. His eyes moved over her face and hands the way they had on the riverbank, that clinical inventory. And something in his expression when he confirmed she was functional was not clinical at all. He looked away. Rios was on the 4th floor. She knew it was Rios because when they came through the stairwell door, he was the only man in the room who didn't move. 4 others moved, toward secondary exits, toward cover, the various responses of people operating on threat response training. Rios stood at the center of the room beside a table covered in documents and a laptop showing what appeared to be port manifests. And he watched Damien come through the door the way you watched something you'd been expecting. He was smaller than she'd imagined from the description. Late 40s, compact, with a stillness about him that she recognized as the same quality Damien had, the absence of unnecessary movement, except where Damien's stillness felt like contained precision. Rios's felt like compressed violence, the specific quality of something waiting for permission. "Voss," he said. "Rios," Damien said. They looked at each other across the room for a moment that had the particular texture of 2 men with a significant shared history that was about to conclude. "The photographer," Rios said. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and entirely flat. "The loose thread." "The journalist," she said, because she was tired of being called a photographer by men who meant it as a diminishment. Something moved in his expression. Not offense. A small recalibration. "The package is already in transit," she said. "Sato has it. By 2 p.m. it's in front of a federal official who isn't Carver and isn't reachable by Senator Holt's people. Whatever you do in this room doesn't stop that." Rios looked at Damien. "She's right," Damien said. Rios was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it. Not breaking, nothing as dramatic as that, just the specific stillness of a man doing rapid strategic arithmetic and arriving at a sum he didn't like. "Holt," he said finally. "Holt is in the documentation," Damien said. "Everything. 6 years. He'll fight it." "He'll lose," Damien said. Rios looked at the table, at the port manifests on the laptop. She had the sense of watching a man understand very clearly that the structure he'd operated within for years had just lost its foundation, that the federal protection that had made the Pacific Coast operation viable was gone, that what remained was the arithmetic of what happened to men like him when the architecture collapsed. He moved fast. She'd expected it, and she still almost didn't track it. A weapon from somewhere at his back, not pointed at Damien, pointed at her, because she was the documentation. She was the connective tissue. She was the one who'd made calls and built the package. And if she was gone, there was a version of the argument that the chain of custody broke. Damien moved at the same moment. The shot was loud in the concrete room, loud in a way that wasn't like the movies, a physical impact of sound that hit her chest and rang in her ears. And for one suspended moment, she genuinely didn't know if she'd been hit, because the shock of the sound and the shock of the motion were indistinguishable from each other. She hadn't been hit. Damien had moved into the line between her and Rios in the same instant that Reyes, from the north end of the room, had fired once, and Rios was down, and Damien was against the east wall, sliding, his left hand at his side. She was across the room before she knew she was moving. "How bad?" she said. He looked at his hand, which he'd pressed against his left side below the ribs. Looked up at her. "Not," he breathed. "Not fatal. I've had worse." "That's not reassuring," she said, and her voice broke slightly on the last word, the first time it had broken in 3 days. And she pressed her hand over his and felt the warmth and the wet, and the very specific terror of proximity to someone she had apparently, without fully deciding to, come to care about in ways that this was not the moment to examine. "Elara." His voice was lower now, the controlled register giving way slightly to something underneath it, the thing she'd been reading in pieces for 3 days finally visible all at once. "The documentation is handled," she said. "Sato has it. It's done." He let out a breath. His head went back against the wall, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and she kept her hand over his and felt his pulse under her fingers and thought about the Tillamook River and a grip like iron closing around her wrist in the dark. "Ambulance," she said to Reyes, who already had his phone out. "I was in surgery for 3 hours." She waited in a hospital corridor in Portland, a real hospital, not a compound, with fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant, and the ordinary human traffic of a Thursday morning emergency department. And she sat in a plastic chair with her camera bag on her lap and her phone in her hand, and she waited. At 11:47, Sato sent a message, "Package delivered, wheels in motion, stay available." At 12:15, a news alert moved across her phone screen. Federal investigators executing search warrants at 3 Portland locations in connection with an organized crime investigation. Senator Holt's name was not yet in the alert. It would be by evening. At 1 p.m., Callum appeared in the corridor and sat down 2 chairs away from her without speaking for a few minutes, and then said, "He's been shot before. He's harder to kill than most people have reason to be." "That's not reassuring either," she said. Callum almost smiled. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." Webb called at 1:30 from a number she didn't recognize. She picked up. "I saw the warrants," he said. "Yes." "Holt?" "By tonight." A silence. "I need to turn myself in," he said. "I know that. I've known it since the cabin." She looked at the corridor floor. "I know a lawyer," she said. "She's good. She'll tell you what cooperation looks like from a legal standpoint." "Will it matter? Cooperation?" "It matters to you," she said. "That's enough of a reason." Another silence. "Elara." His voice was different now, the performance of it fully gone. What was left something older and more genuine and more damaged. "I'm sorry, I know that it doesn't fix Park," she said. "No." "But call the lawyer," she said. "Her name is Diaz. I'll send you the number." She hung up and saddled with the phone and thought about 12 years of lunches and stories and the particular intimacy of professional trust and what it meant when that trust turned out to have been built on something that wasn't there. She didn't forgive him. She didn't know if she ever would. But she sent him the number because Park deserved better than a system that buried what had happened to her, and Webb's cooperation was part of how that didn't happen. She put the phone in her pocket. A daughter who was 11. She kept coming back to that. The surgeon came out at 2:47 and said the word stable, and Elara's whole body exhaled in a single long release that she hadn't fully known she was holding. They let her in at 4. I was in a bed by the window, IV line, monitors, the particular deflation of a person who had been running on operational adrenaline for 3 days and had now been chemically instructed to stop. He looked, she thought, more like a person and less like a function than she had ever seen him look, which was either the surgery or something else. He looked at her when she came in and said nothing for a moment. "Sato," she said. "I know. Reyes told me." His voice was rough from the anesthetic. "Holt. By tomorrow it'll be everywhere." He nodded. Looked at the window. Outside was the flat gray Portland afternoon, clouds moving in off the coast, the city going about itself below. "The Salcedo group," he said. "Without Holt's cover, without Rios, without the port infrastructure, they can rebuild. Somewhere else. Give it 5 years. Maybe, she said. But not here, not like this. Not like this, he agreed. She sat in the chair beside the bed. Her shoulder ached with a slow, grinding persistence that she'd been ignoring for 6 hours and could no longer entirely ignore. She was aware that she smelled like a warehouse in a 3-day crisis, and that her jacket still had river water stiffness in the lining from Wednesday night, which felt like several years ago. Your organization, she said. What happens to it? I was quiet for a moment. What I told you that first morning in the compound, about a cleaner path. You told me that was what you intended, she said carefully. You didn't tell me it was what would happen. He looked at her. No, he said. I didn't. He shifted slightly against the pillow, wincing in a way that he visibly didn't want to be visible. It won't be simple. There are people in my network who won't accept a change in direction. There are obligations that predate my decision to change direction. He paused. There is a great deal of weight to move. But you're going to try. He held her gaze. Yes. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why she believed him, except that she'd been reading people for 10 years and she'd gotten Webb wrong, but she didn't think she was getting this wrong, and also that she'd watched him spend 3 days operating from a set of values that weren't simple to categorize but were consistent, which was sometimes more than you could say for people who lived entirely within the law. Damien, she said. Yes. She looked at her hands. The camera bag on the floor beside her chair, battered, river stiffened, containing the equipment she'd carried through all of it. I don't know what the next part of this looks like, she said. My apartment is... I don't know if it's safe to go back to. My professional situation is... She almost laughed. Complicated doesn't cover it. I have a story that's going to be published under someone else's byline because that was the operational necessity, and I understand that, but it's still... Your images will be part of the federal record, he said. The photographer of record is documented in the chain of custody. Your professional credit isn't gone. That's not what I'm saying. I know, he said. What are you saying? She looked at him in the gray afternoon light. The monitors made their quiet sounds. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm saying I don't know yet. I was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable place to be. 3 days ago, I was driving home from Seaside with $43 in my checking account, she said, trying to sell a story nobody commissioned. And now? Now I've been inside a federal organized crime investigation. I've handed over documentation that's going to take down a senator, I've been shot at, and the man who pulled me out of a river is in a hospital bed. She looked at him. I don't have a category for this. Something moved in his expression. The thing she'd been reading in pieces, the thing beneath the controlled surface, visible now in the uncomplicated way of someone too tired and too medicated to manage it fully. It was not simple, and it was not small, and she recognized it because she'd been feeling its equivalent in herself for 3 days while pretending she wasn't. When I'm out of this bed, he said carefully, I'd like to talk to you about the next part. The next part, she said, of whatever this is, he said. If you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment, the gray light, the monitors. His hand on the white hospital blanket, which still had a bruise along the wrist from something in the warehouse that she hadn't noticed until now. Ask me again when you can walk, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, the closest thing to a genuine smile she'd seen from him, small and unmanaged and completely real. Fair enough, he said. Hatsan. Senator Raymond Holt was indicted on federal charges 17 days later. The indictment covered 6 years of conspiracy, bribery of federal officials, and facilitation of weapons trafficking, 41 counts in total, the most significant organized crime-adjacent prosecution in Pacific Northwest history, according to the coverage that ran in every major outlet, including the national paper that Teruko Sato worked for, whose investigative team had built the published story from the package Alara had delivered on a Thursday morning in a transit hub in Tualatin, while 3 men in unmemorable clothes tried to intercept her. Her name was in the photographer credit. A single line at the bottom of the published piece in the standard format. Photographs by Alara Whitmore. Small, adequate, the appropriate professional acknowledgement of someone who had done their job. Reyes called her when the indictment dropped and said, He's asking if you saw it. Tell him I saw it, she said. He also says the walking issue has been resolved. She was quiet for a moment. Tell him I'll come Thursday. Marcus Webb entered into a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors 6 weeks after the indictment. The agreement required full disclosure of his 11 months of payments and intelligence activity, testimony in the proceedings against Carver and two other compromised officials, and a guilty plea on a single conspiracy count. His lawyer, Diaz, who was as good as Ilara had said, negotiated a sentence that kept him out of prison. Ilara did not attend any of the proceedings. She did, 2 months later, go to a small memorial for Park that Reyes organized quietly, a gathering of a dozen people in a park in southeast Portland on a cold February morning. She stood at the back and said nothing, and afterward walked home, through a city that didn't know what had happened in it, which was the usual condition of cities and usually didn't bother her, and on that particular morning did. She photographed the memorial. She didn't publish the photographs. Some things weren't for publication. What? She went to see Damien on a Thursday in December, 3 weeks after Reyes's call, driving her new car, a used Subaru, sensible, better brakes than the Civic had ever had, up into the Oregon hills on roads she now knew well, through the tree cover and past the gate that opened before she reached it. He met her at the door of the main building, which was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she just remembered it differently now that the threat architecture had changed. He was wearing the dark suit without the tie, collar open, as he'd been the first time she'd seen him clearly in the daylight. He was walking without difficulty, which she noticed and filed alongside the particular complicated warmth that had taken up residence in her chest over the past 3 weeks, every time she thought about what Reyes had said. The walking issue has been resolved. They stood at the door for a moment in the cold December air. You came, he said. I came, she said. He looked at her face with the complete attention she had never stopped finding, simultaneously unnerving and something else she had a better word for now. Then he held the door and she walked past him into the warmth of the compound's main room, where a fire was going in the stone fireplace, and the table had been cleared of its operational debris. And through the tall windows, the Oregon hills were white with the first snow of the season, quiet and very still. She set her camera bag down. He sat across from her at the table and she sat. And they were quiet for a moment, the fire and the snow light between them, and she thought about Wednesday nights and rivers and a hand closing around her wrist in the dark, and she thought about Park and Webb's daughter, who was 11, and 41 federal counts, and a photographer credit in a single line at the bottom of a national story. She thought about $43 in a checking account, the camera card in her jacket pocket, 800 photographs that had changed the configuration of everything. You said you wanted to talk about the next part, she said. I did, he said. So talk, she said. He looked at her across the table and the fire moved in the fireplace and the snow came down outside with the particular silence of the first snow, and whatever he said next. And she already knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had been reading a face for 3 days and 3 weeks, and would apparently be reading it for some time to come, that it would not be simple, that nothing about this was simple, that simple was a thing that had never once been available in this story and was not going to make a late appearance now. Whatever he said next, she was already leaning forward slightly to hear it, because she had driven up into the Oregon hills on a December Thursday, because she had set down her camera bag, because some choices, she had learned, were made not in the moment of decision, but in the long series of moments that preceded it, each one small and ordinary and unremarkable in itself, each one a fraction of a direction, until you looked up and found yourself somewhere you hadn't planned on being and understood, with a clarity that was better than any photograph she'd ever taken, that you had been heading here all along. She was not surviving anymore. She was beginning. And that after everything, the river and the warehouse and the hospital corridor and all the cold, difficult, unglamorous miles between them, was the most extraordinary thing she had ever photographed with a camera that wasn't in her hands. Some things you just had to see with your own eyes. And keep.